monarchy rabbit hole. A lot of Canadians, to say nothing of foreigners, never really figure out what Canada's whole situation with Great Britain is, which makes sense since it is basically an intentionally muddled state of affairs that was deliberately supposed to blur the realities of what modern Canada is with the nostalgic fantasies of those who wish it was still something else. In 1931, Canada was granted complete political independence from the British Empire, except when it came to amendments to the Canadian Constitution. That last remaining power wasn't granted to the Canadian government until 1982, 2 years before I was born, and the 30th year of the Queen's reign. This picture of the Queen signing the final document of Canadian independence is one of the great iconic images of Canadian history. But Canada is also a place whose leaders have always had a curiously ambivalent attitude towards their own country's independence. Well into the early 20th century, in fact, by which point Canada was already almost entirely self-governing, independence was still considered a dirty word in some corners of Canadian politics. Canada's greatest Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, even has this infamous quote where he says, "We have found that our Canadian independence is quite compatible with our dependence as a colony." A lot of this has to do with the anti-American way that Canadian patriotism has traditionally been defined. Since the Americans derived their patriotic national identity from a rejection of the British Empire, Canada would derive its patriotic national identity from an embrace of that empire, with anyone who was seen as being too critical of the imperial bonds being denounced as some sort of unpatriotic closet America lover. I have a whole other video where I talk about this philosophy of Canadian identity in more detail. But the point is, it was partially for this reason that even as Canada negotiated its independence from Britain in the late 1920s, it was still taken for granted that some sort of connection to the British Crown would continue forever. Luckily, this was an attitude that was very much in sync with the goals of the British Foreign Service of the time. The UK very much wanted to maintain close economic and strategic ties to the so-called self-governing white dominions like Canada, Australia, and South Africa, particularly with the possibility of another world war on the horizon. The British were also keen to maintain a certain facade of strength in the face of their European rivals and pretend like their empire was not in fact rapidly crumbling around them. So it was in this context that the British Commonwealth of Nations was born. The idea that there could be some new form of empire that was based around the symbolic British monarchy rather than harsh British political rule. It was an idea that had been discussed for a while, but was not formally enshrined in British law until the passage of the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which grandly stated that
the Crown is the symbol of the free association of the members of the British Commonwealth of Nations, and they are united by a common allegiance to the Crown.
And Canada was one of the inaugural members of this new club. And herein we find the root of the confusion that still haunts us to this day. What exactly does it mean for independent countries to be united in common allegiance to the Crown? It is worth noting that even now, 90 years later, the practical significance of this union has never really been expanded beyond this vague aspirational statement. I, as a Canadian, certainly do not have any more rights to do anything in Britain or Australia or any other country united in common allegiance to the Crown than any other foreigner does. A common allegiance to the Crown doesn't mean we live under any sort of common regime of laws or citizenship. A lot of people all over the world seem to think it does, however. Even here, I will often hear Canadians say ignorant things like, "Yeah, you know, I think I might go and study in Australia for the summer. You know, we can do that because of, like, the Commonwealth or whatever." Things only got weirder in 1949 when the British allowed the newly independent Republic of India to become part of the Commonwealth, despite the fact that the Indian government had explicitly chosen to reject the common allegiance to the Crown and wanted a government with no trappings of monarchy whatsoever. But the British were just as eager to maintain a tight strategic alliance with independent India as they had been with independent Canada and Australia. So they agreed to soften the status of the British monarch into just the head of the Commonwealth, a non-monarchical, non-constitutional office that lacked even symbolic authority over India, but was still said to be relevant to India in some way. In the years that followed, the Commonwealth would massively expand into a relatively generic, make the world a better place NGO, comprised of 56 member nations, mostly former British colonies, but not universally and not exclusively, with the vast majority rejecting the idea of being in common allegiance to the crown. According to this excellent book on the history of the Commonwealth, The Empire's New Clothes by Philip Murphy, the modern Commonwealth is a profoundly informal and tenuous association that has achieved extremely little as far as humanitarian or diplomatic goals are concerned, in part because it has very little money and doesn't really know what it exists to do. But that has allowed mythology to fill the void, in which people's fantasies of what they would like an alliance of former British colonies under vague royal patronage to be often plays a bigger role in defining the Commonwealth than the Commonwealth itself. On February the 6th, 1952, George VI died suddenly in his sleep. He was the man who had been the third head of the Commonwealth and king of the 8 independent nations who did want to be united in common allegiance to the crown. In his place came his daughter, Elizabeth, who was only 25 years old. Her youth made it clear to everyone that this was a woman who would play a very significant role in shaping our understandings of the monarchy for many generations to come. That December, Winston Churchill convened a summit of the Commonwealth Prime Ministers in London, where there was some discussion over what title to give this new queen. By that time, it had occurred that the Commonwealth's stated goal of being an alliance of countries that were equal in status, in no way subordinate to one another, was somewhat undermined by the fact that they were united in common allegiance to the monarch of just one of these countries, the United Kingdom. Accordingly, when it came to the new Queen's title, they
concluded that, in the present stage of development of the Commonwealth relationship, it would be in accord with the established constitutional position that each member country should use for its own purposes a form suitable to its own particular circumstances, but retaining a substantial element common to all.
And with that, the Canadian government under Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent was given the go-ahead to pass the Royal Styles and Titles Act, which officially gave Elizabeth II the title of Queen of Canada that would so irritate me 50 years later. Although even this was a bit more ambiguous than it sounds, the Canadian Royal Styles and Titles Act actually calls her Elizabeth II by the grace of God of the United Kingdom, Canada, and her other realms and territories, Queen, Head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith. You basically have to keep that United Kingdom bit in there because the preamble to the Canadian Constitution quite explicitly says that Canada is supposed to be a dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom. So even a full generation after Wilfrid Laurier, Canada was still trying to square its independence as a nation with a desire for some form of continued colonial dependence. And the Queen played along. She visited Canada 22 times during the course of her 70-year reign, offering her royal presence whenever the government requested it, cutting ribbons, dedicating buildings, giving speeches, and of course, signing laws granting Canada further political independence. Now, I have never been much of a nationalist, but like most Canadians, I do value Canada's status as an independent country. I think it is important that we respect this achievement of our history, and granting the British monarch the title of Queen of Canada and continuing to give her a constitutional role in our system of government, including requirements that all of our top political officials swear allegiance to her and recognize her as the country's highest legal authority,
that I shall be a true and faithful servant to Her Majesty,
undermines that independence. It makes Canada look like a strange and immature place in the eyes of the world, and continues to elevate a sort of shallow anti-American contrarianism to the center of our national identity, where we try to convince ourselves that an obviously foreign tradition like royalty is somehow the moral core of Canadian nationhood, as a famous Canadian historian once put it, all because America doesn't have it. And so, at age 18, I was inspired to join Citizens for a Canadian Republic, a small activist group that advocates cutting Canada's ties to the British Crown. And when Queen Elizabeth came to Vancouver in 2002 as part of her Golden Jubilee tour, I was invited to go on the CBC to make the case for why our ties to the monarchy were bad.
We're an independent, sovereign nation. We're in the 21st century now. I think it's time to get rid of these antiquated notions of having a foreign monarch having a colonial British leader. It's just irrelevant to today's society.
It was the very first time I had ever appeared on television, and in many ways that appearance set in motion what would become a career in TV punditry for me, which then transitioned into my YouTube career I have today. This is good advice for anyone who wants to go into pundit stuff, by the way. When